Hey everyone, it's Howie Ree, and this is the From Business School to Startup series where I interview Duke alums who have gone from business school directly into starting their own companies. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by Mitchel Gorecki, who is a double Dukey. And for those of you who don't know what that means, he went to Duke undergrad and to Duke for business school. Thanks a lot for joining us, Mitchel.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Great. So let's just start right from undergrad. So talk a little bit about what you studied at Duke. What year did you graduate from Duke? And what was it like to be at Duke?
Yeah, certainly, Howie. So I was Duke undergrad 2013. I studied biomed engineering, mechanical engineering, economics, and had a concentration in finance. So clearly I knew exactly what I wanted to do.
Quadruple major. Quadruple major. Love it. All right.
I think part of that stemmed from I had parents who were double MDs, an anesthesiologist and a neurosurgeon. And so although I knew I really liked the entrepreneurship side of things, I liked building things, but I also wanted to cover the pre-med route.
Very cool. Very cool. And so talk a little bit about what it was like to be at Duke as an undergrad. What was the culture like there, and what year did you graduate?
So I graduated in 2013, and it was a fantastic experience. I found that there was a little bit of everything for everyone. You really just had to find a niche that you belonged in. So I think kind of a great example of that is I completely fell in love with engineering. Everybody there is fantastic and very supportive of absolutely whatever it is you wanted to build. Finding mentorship in people at the economics department to support my thesis. And even friends through organizations like Brownstone. I think all of those relationships really help you figure out your path and figure out your passion and what you really want to pursue.
That's great. So you ended up doing some entrepreneurial stuff while you were an undergrad. Talk a little bit about that.
I did. So I don't know if you recall, I believe we first met in 2010. I submitted a pitch deck for your startup competition in the early days. I believe it was taking cell phones, they're gathering data from cell phones to create better insurance packages for drivers. We didn't really make it that far, but it was a really good experience for my sophomore year. I did it again junior year and again senior year. I would add we did not win any of those times, but it was a fantastic learning experience for understanding the process of how you actually convey an idea on paper.
That's great. And so you end up graduating, like you said, in 2013, and your first job is at a company called MaxPoint, which most people probably won't have heard of, but it's a company that's locally here in the city of Raleigh. So talk a little bit about how'd you get that job and what was your role there?
Certainly. So my sophomore year, I applied to work at MaxPoint as an intern and was rejected. They favored candidates who had PhDs in machine learning. In my sophomore year, I found them again, and with some encouragement from one of the deans at the economics department, I had some support in pitching my thesis to them and how we could use that in online advertising, which is what they were doing. So the gentleman who took me under his wing, named Michael Els, essentially gave me a job offer as one of the first data analytics hires for MaxPoint. And so what MaxPoint did is we were effectively buying and placing online advertising across domains and individuals. So we were the people who knew what car you drive, how many children you had, your income, where you went to college, to figure out what you were likely to consume and what ads we should show you. And so that was my job to do the machine learning analysis behind that to drive that engine. So I joined that company in 2012, wound up writing a senior thesis under their guidance, worked with them from then 13 and 14, and we took that company public in about the middle of 2014. And that was one of the big stepping stones for me in terms of deciding whether or not I wanted to launch into trying to start my own venture, work for another startup again, or go to business school. And so through a lot of soul searching, I wound up deciding that getting an MBA was the best option.
That's great. And so before we get to you starting your MBA program, you started to have a little bit of a side hustle, if you will, where you were doing some stuff with real estate. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It really stemmed from not being able to afford my own rent. It was simply I was renting a house knew the easiest way to make it cost effective was to find roommates. The first time we did it, we wound up living for something like $213 a person, which was just ludicrous. And then the second iteration of that, we figured that as we got more and more demand for that house, and we had a limited amount of supply, the natural solution was for the per cost of the room to go up. And so we had people who would be willing to pay us almost $950 a month per room that would only cost $216. And so we were able to find really, really good living accommodations that were very, very affordable for these people. And in doing so, it kind of hit me, holy smokes, if you could create a marketplace for these bedrooms to clear, you would be doing a really great service for these people. And so that was really where the idea stemmed. It was out of a need for myself.
So let's dive in a little bit here. So you're renting a house, and again, you say you're looking for roommates. And the key thing here is that you figured out that there were other people who actually wanted the service of, they'd be willing to pay you more than you were paying per room because they wanted kind of the service you were providing, which is a house that was kind of furnished. They don't have to take care of, signing the lease or, getting all the kind of other amenities. Just talk a little bit more about that kind of, that customer kind of use case. Like, what is it that
Precisely. So I like comparing it to Uber Pool. I think it's a great example. You have an asset, the car, that is going to have a utility. It's going to drive from point A to point B, and that utility will disappear and be gone forever. And if there's an empty seat in it, then you've lost out. And so effectively, Living Lab does something very similar, but for houses and bedrooms. We are able to match people based on preferences for budget, location, and timing in real time to figure out what are the combinations of people who would actually enjoy living together, who could comfortably split a lease. And then given their combined budgets, what are the homes in which they fit into? And then how much margin is there for Living Lab to collect a fee? And what we found is that fee could wildly range from anywhere from 5% to 200%, which leads into another interesting business question of defining the ethics for actually what you're optimizing. Are you there to maximize the rent for the landlord, or are you there to minimize the cost for the tenant while still being able to survive? Or are you trying to maximize the relationships between the people living there?
Right. And knowing you're just a very thoughtful guy, and you are thinking about, not only the financial aspect of it, but also the ethical aspect of it, which something I kind of appreciate and admire about you. And so let's talk just a little bit more about the actual revenues that are coming in before business school starts, because not only did you do it for your own house, but you actually started to rent other properties and provided this service to other people. So by the time you end up getting into business school, how many properties do you have? How much money are you making in revenue per month?
Well, so this is part of the funny story is there was no entity at this point to be writing those rental payments to, or to be leveraging any credit against. And so all of these were under my personal name, and we were running 4 of them. And so effectively I was guaranteeing the rent on the properties and then securing the tenants as quickly as possible, knowing that I had enough demand that I could almost guarantee that this house would be full. But there was the downside risk that if it didn't fill, I would be on the hook for the rent.
Right. So you actually are you're the leasee, if you will, the lessor on 4 different properties, and you're like, I have to find roommates. Like I can't. So you're taking on risk, right?
Right.
So you come to business school. Talk a little bit about that, and just talk a little bit about why you thought that business school was right for you. For example, somebody might say, hey, like you did this with 4 properties. Why don't we just scale that up to 20 properties? So did you consider that path? And if so, how did you make that decision?
No, I absolutely did. And I sought advice from my current CEO at MaxPoint, through my advisor, Michael, who's also at MaxPoint, as well as a couple of individuals at Duke, and ended up reaching out to a bunch of venture capitalists and wound up with just a really low response rate. I found it very difficult to drive that business forward without that credentialing. And I don't think it speaks as much to the education itself, but to the branding that you give yourself coming out of an MBA program. And so one of the really distinct memories I have actually includes you. Before my business school, I said, gosh, Howie, I'm this undergrad who's trying to do this idea, and I cannot for the life of me get to speak with Josh Felser. And you essentially said, oh, well, I'll just fire off an email. And I swear within about 5 minutes, I had a meeting with him. And so it became so readily apparent how important that network was, and that Duke branding, and to be associated with that sort of a background.
That's cool. And thanks for sharing that story. And so, and Josh, for those that are just watching, Josh is with Freestyle Capital, is a Duke alum, and has had 2 successful exits with his own companies, and is probably one of Duke's most active investors, and he's based in the Bay Area and is a great supporter of what we do. So that's great. So let's talk about kind of the year, the kind of months where you're starting business school, and it's a lot, right? I mean, there's a lot of classes. There's 400 plus new people to meet just in your class alone. Just talk about what was that experience like, separate from the entrepreneurship, what was that experience like for you coming to Fuqua?
Well, for starters, it was a fantastic experience. That's partly why I'm wearing my Team Fuqua shirt. So Section 1, hoorah. It was definitely, beginning business school and starting a company cannot be done at the same time. And I rapidly realized there was absolutely no way to fully commit to starting this company while fulfilling the class obligations. And so you find ways to free up as much time as possible, be it taking as many of the pre-entrance exams as possible to fill up on credits, as well as figuring out how to minimize time load in your schedule. But I do distinctly remember receiving feedback from a number of investors saying, well, it's very difficult for me to rationalize investing in a company with a CEO who isn't able to fully devote his time, which I think makes complete sense. I know one of the things that I found personally very, very difficult was just the amount of FOMO, or the fear of missing out from just everything going on campus. There's a tremendous number of opportunities to the extent at which you could completely fill your day without going to a single class. And so you wind up in situations where you have almost 380 of your 450 classmates who are in suits recruiting for consulting. And you ask yourself, gosh, why am I not in a suit also recruiting for consulting? I can very heartfelt say there were moments where I was quite literally crying with one of the other students in my class, trying to figure out why we were both so upset that we weren't also recruiting consulting. I do remember one of the big moments for me was I was standing in John Deere's office and received a call from one of the career management people at Fuqua. And quite literally they said, hey, we just got a call from the recruiter at John Deere. They're going to extend you an offer. I thought, oh, that's funny that they knew before I knew. And this guy goes, I don't understand. We spoke a week ago about how you were going to start this company. I really hope you don't. This makes absolutely no sense. Why are you doing this? Stop it. And that was a big moment for me, partly to realize that I did have somebody in my court supporting me through this. And so finding that community who actually wanted to take on this adventure and try something different was very, very helpful for me. I think going back to Josh Belzer, another really helpful one was I remember going into the summer, I called him and pitched him, essentially asking for advice. And he says, I tell you what, call me at the end of the summer after you've turned down your internship. The summer is gone and you've actually started writing code, and then we'll have some serious discussions. And it really just got back to the whole, the commitment. Nobody's going to jump at this before you do. So you have to do it.
So that's great. So, so you've already added a little bit of color onto kind of first year of business school. Let's actually dive in a little bit more onto some of the elements that were specifically focused on entrepreneurship. So, the program for entrepreneurs, or P4E as we like to call it, it starts with a kickoff in July, and then you kind of recruit some teammates in. And in the fall, you have an initial class focusing on kind of validating the opportunity. Obviously, you had a head start on that since you actually had paying customers. And then in the spring, in the second course, you were paired with some computer science students who were undergrads who were doing a computer science course in parallel while you were working on it from business school. So let's just start to talk through from the kickoff through the kind of the beginning portions there. And what was that like for you as a person that was like, I've come to business school in part to start a company?
Well, I think there were three really helpful things. I think the first is actually receiving credit for doing something that was very related to schoolwork. As much as I loved the marketing classes, I found way more marketing knowledge out of actually trying to understand how to convey an idea to somebody. I think the second really big piece in it was having those introductions to other students who were trying to pursue something similar. I want to say we spoke and or worked with probably somewhere between 30 and 40 of the students who are going through the program to actually secure our core team, who two of them are now currently with us today. I think the third really, really big piece was the introduction and getting to meet all of the industry experts. So people like David Spitz, people like Scott Wingo, just provided a lot of insight as to what are those next steps that you actually do and who are the people I talk to next.
Right, and yeah, and led to additional conversations like Fuqua alum, Jed Carlson. And so for people that don't know who David Spitz is, he's the CEO of Channel Advisor, which is a public company locally. Scott Wingo is the founder of Channel Advisor and also has founded a few other companies, and is both of them are great supporters of the local ecosystem. And then Josh Felser, I know he introduced you to some people. So let's talk through the spring now a little bit more, and this is some of your core teammates. So Colin and Patrick, who are now still with you. How many years later is it now? It's
2.5.
2.5 years later. So I mean, very important relationship for you. So as I remember, Colin and Patrick were both matched with you in this computer science course, although Patrick is more, I think, hardcore computer science, and I think Colin was less on the hardcore computer science side. So just talk about what did you do with them during that spring course, and how did, of all the other people that you were working with, how did it come to be that these two ended up being the ones that continued working with you?
My goodness, well, this one somewhat gives me chills. So I think it really goes back to making that big jump. So I turned down the John Deere offer. I had stopped recruiting. I had stopped the consulting recruiting specifically. No more talking with GM Finance, and had actually decided this is what I'm going to do this summer. And at this point, Duke was very generous, and 3-year program had chipped us $5,000 as a grant to stay this summer. And I remember speaking with Patrick because this was his big moment. He had graduated Duke undergrad. He had a very nice job offer in New York. And the big question was, does he continue to build this, or does he go join a large corporation? And that decision came all the way down to the last day, where he decided on the day he was supposed to start that he was actually going to stay in Durham and do Living Lab. And that was a big commitment. That was everything from us splitting a house to really grinding this out to working out of the Duke IME building in downtown Durham. And that was, I would say, the first level of commitment. And the goal there was to get out an MVP. It was to show that we could actually use technology to create these rental contracts, and it didn't have to be done on paper with a real person. And the big jumping point then was I received an email from you, actually, with an introduction to a group called PAIR. So this is Pedgman and Marr Venture Capital. And they were seeking investment opportunities in essentially MVP level startups. And that was what led to our first investment.
And I want to make sure that I got the timing right here for the video. So PAIR was your second year? Is that true? PAIR was your second year spring?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, correct. It was as I was graduating.
PAIR was your second year spring, and PAIR Ventures, a Bay Area investor, they were running an accelerator program for the summer. And the way I tell the story is that I got a cold email from them. unfortunately, I didn't know Pear from before the email. I looked at it. I said, "Hey, this looks good. I'm gonna hit forward on it to my Duke University listservs, undergrads, grads, Fuqua students, and see if anybody's interested in applying." And luckily, you were one, and that made it worth it. So, and let's just get a little bit of timing straight for other people too. So Patrick graduated. Was that in line with when you graduated?
No, so he was 2017. So it was 1 year apart.
So he's 1 year apart. You're about to go into your summer and say, I'm doing this full time this summer. And Patrick is about to leave for New York.
Right.
And at the last minute, he's like, you know what, Mitchell, like, I believe in this. Like, let's give it a shot. And that's just for a summer, right? Because, you're going for a summer, you hadn't necessarily committed beyond that. Maybe in theory you had. So, and then let's talk about Colin. Because Patrick becomes your CTO, your Chief Technology Officer. Colin is, I forget what year he was at that same time.
At this point, I believe he was a junior.
I think he's a junior. And so he also says, I believe, I'm also in for the summer. And
well, so at this point, we were just in discussions. And I remember the first time I met him, he dressed very, very nicely and invited me to a cup of coffee. And I think I showed up in gym.
This is like before the class even. He's just like,
yeah, he's a total go-getter. And he was convinced that this was the New Ventures team he wanted to launch a startup with. But that he wanted to vet us and make sure we were actually serious, because if he was going to spend his time, he wanted it to be spent wisely. And so he did a very good job at pitching himself as to what he was going to bring to the table. I thought it was a fantastic fit, and it clearly has worked out very, very well.
And just so we're clear, so Colin, his role is not so much technical, but he did kind of get connected to you in part through the computer science class, or that carved out a little bit of time for him. I think either that or he just informally sat with you during those classes.
I want to say he informally sat, and then we found a way to get him involved in the course.
Good. Okay. Good. Well. It's great because it worked out. It worked out for everybody. Okay. So, and that first summer, okay, like, other people, your classmates, they're doing typical MBA internships, right? They're going to investment banking or consulting or working at, Google or, Facebook or Medtronic or wherever, they're getting MBA level, internships and pay and whatnot. And you stay in Durham, and I think you live in a house, and do you share that house with Patrick and Colin?
Oh, yeah.
You guys are typical startup. You're kind of just making it work. And you're working from those offices that summer too?
This was working out of that house as well as your communal space.
Are for free, right? So really, like, it was, just to be fair for everybody who is new to startups, it was kind of unglamorous.
Oh, this was not sexy. This was not, I would not call this fun or glamorous at all. This was, I think I made something like 400 phone calls to prospective tenants.
Yep.
And just rifled through, I had these sticky notes of everybody on a wall and trying to figure out how I could match them together into housing as best as possible.
Yep.
This was a grind.
So let's talk about two more moments that were still in your first year of your MBA, but kind of spring semester here. One was spring break, and the way I recall it, and please clarify if my memory is off here. I think you were like, hey, like, Josh Felser said he would take a meeting with me. I think I'm going to go out there to the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. Do you know anybody else to connect me with? And I think that, like, at a very last minute thing, like 1 to 2 days before you were about to fly out, we got some great connections to George Northup, who's an amazing Duke alum, been CEO of 5 companies, and some other people. And I think that Josh ends up being like, hey, it turns out, like, I can't meet with you, unfortunately, but, like, you have a great trip because you meet a bunch of other people. But again, this is showing your commitment. You're like, everybody else might be going to the beach for spring break or, playing golf all week. And you're like, I'm going to the Bay Area, and I'm not even sure what my full itinerary is. Is that roughly right?
It's pretty close. I think the one really funny one, the part of the trip was I had just come out of one of your classes where David Spitz had given a talk. And it was very clear that he had a very good way of approaching problems. And so I asked him if I could walk him to his car and pitch him on what I was working on. He obliged. I got maybe 2 minutes into it, and he said, I tell you what, I quite like this, and I can tell you're hustling. Why don't we have lunch one day? So I had lunch with him the next week, finished the pitch, and he goes, gosh, I actually see a place for this in the world. Why don't you speak to the people who helped get me off the ground? Why don't you meet this guy by the name of Jeff? So I thought, okay, we'll run the gambit and meet Jeff. I get an invitation to meet Jeff through Jeff's secretary, and on it, it says Sand Hill Road, Palo Alto. And so I called David. I said, am I really going to go out to California just to meet with this guy? He goes, yes, you absolutely are. And I remember being in the Uber going to Jeff's office, and I get a call from David, and he goes, how did it go? I said, well, I haven't actually met him yet, but I'm going to. And he goes, you don't really seem very excited. And I said, well, this has been quite a slog to get out here. And he goes, oh my Lord, you have no idea who Jeff is. Please do some Googling and be prepared and don't blow this for me. And that was when I realized that Jeff Jordan was the CEO of OpenTable in the founders circle at PayPal and eBay, and was now one of the head partners at Andreessen Horowitz. And here I was about to pitch him on a napkin as to what we had been working on for a few weeks. And so that was an enormous learning experience. Jeff is an awesome person, gave us some great feedback, but most critically, he set up the introduction to the next 4 angel investors, notably Josh Koppelman and Harrison Metal, which then led to the next 20 introductions, which then led to the next 100 introductions. And so after pitching about 200 times was when we actually led up to getting introduced to Pair.
That's great. That's great to have that context for the story, and how, you had both on how you had 200 conversations before Pair with investors, but also how you, how you have to treat everybody well and do well in each meeting, because, it's a network where your reputation ends up kind of going in front of you, and people will introduce you, and that can mean, kind of a really helpful conversation. So the other thing I want to talk about that happened, I think during your first year, and then we'll switch over to second year, and then just kind of get to how you end up, graduating and deciding, this is it, I'm going to go for it. So the other thing that happened first year is, I'm pretty sure there was an apartment fair spring semester for the incoming first year MBA student. So you're a first year MBA student, but there's the new class. And, for the most part, this apartment fair is for, apartments, and the apartments, apartment buildings that are like, hey, we're trying to, get MBA students. And you're wanting to pitch there because you're like, hey, like, this is a great target market to use our product and to get some customer research. And I think that they kind of blocked you. They kind of were like, this is a little bit weird. You might be an MBA student, but I don't understand why you want to be here. So just talk about that. Talk about kind of the, what lesson came at you from that.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the biggest lessons I had is to really understand who you're doing business with and how they're incentivized. And so specifically, the housing fair is organized by the Chronicle, and the Chronicle is incentivized to produce ad revenue, and the people who buy those ads are the housing providers. And so there's no incentive or desire for the Chronicle to have us be there, because it detracts from their ad revenue. And so there was a little bit of tension right from the get-go from that perspective. But we were able to find a way to get a booth to pitch about how we were going to help people actually transact these properties. And we actually wound up getting more supply side business from the neighboring booths of people trying to rent out their properties than we did incoming business school students, which I found very comical.
So the apartment building was like, hey, what are you up to? And you're like, well, actually, we're doing this thing. And they're like, oh my gosh, that sounds amazing. Can we use that to rent out spots in our building, right?
Precisely.
Yeah. Okay, good. That's great. So we're going to jump into second year, but just talk about summer, right? So you get to the end of summer. Is it a success or not? And if it was a success, how did you know? And what was the outcome?
So this was the first big leap where we actually started writing code and building a product and trying to find fit with the market. It was no longer a ideation of, okay, we're going to match these people into housing and close these rental contracts. And so I think one of the big pieces about the summer was really figuring out what the business model was. And this was actually, I completely attribute this to First Round Capital and Josh Koppelman. We anticipated being able to charge a percentage of rent or a fee to the tenant for the value we were creating, tenant or landlord. And what Josh immediately pointed out is he goes, gosh, nobody's going to pay you $1,000 up front for closing this rental contract. Sure, that's the value you produce, but it's over an entire year. And so you have to be able to provide lasting value. And this is just, this model will not be sustainable and it will not result in high yield growth. And so you had to rework things to figure out how we could provide that lasting value, given that the whole pitch was, hey, we match you up front. And so that really helped us figure out what the product would look like, as well as the long-term relationship with the actual end user.
That's great. So, so moving into second year, you did something unusual. So most business school students, they go into second year and they still have a year's worth of classes to take. And so I remember very clearly you're going into second year and we have a conversation and you're like, Howie, I'm going to work it out so I can graduate in December. And I'm going to, I forget what it was exactly. I had some credits that I passed out of at the beginning of business school. I'm going to overload here and I'm going to make it so that starting in January, I'm able to work kind of full-time on this business. Talk about that. I mean, that's a testament to you and to your commitment, but just talk about how you did that.
So I think the first is going into it and having already taken a fair number of the entrance exams. Whether or not it was fair that I took them or not is a whole other story. So
do you remember how many classes you passed out of at the beginning of business school, roughly?
I want to say it was 5 of them.
5 of them, which is a lot. I mean, I think the core is maybe it changes from year to every few years, but I think it might be 8 classes in the
core is 8.
Yeah. Okay.
And part of my strategy was getting the textbooks that these tests were actually being, the content was being driven from, and just reading them and then sitting for the exam. And found that if you could perform well enough, that it would justify getting credit for the course. But to your point, that I knew that I needed to be able to fully commit to this idea, even though I was a business school student. And the only way to prove that was to either to have already graduated or to have all of your time back to pursue this full time. And so I had found a way to take the 2-year program and turn it into about 1.25 years. The only downside being is if you take that few classes in your second year, you end up losing, I believe you lose the health insurance portion. And so I had to take additional courses throughout the year to maintain that status as a student.
Right. And so you do it and it's a certain amount of extra work to do. And you get to January, and I think this is roughly when PAIR starts to enter the picture, if I remember correctly. But let's just be clear. You're in January of your second year, right? You've got 1 semester left, but you're pretty much done. A lot of your classmates have investment banking or consulting or whatever, all the other kinds of jobs that we talked about that are paying 120, 130, 150K a year, a signing bonus, and they're off at the Washington Duke Inn playing golf or whatnot, right? And you don't do that, and you're working from our offices for free downtown, which is great. We get to see each other most days. But talk about that mindset, right? Because that's a mindset where you're like, I'm going for it, but at the same time, you don't have the capital in hand. You've talked to 200 people, many of those investors, but you don't have a check. And there's got to be days where you wake up and you're like, oh man, like what's going on? Like, why isn't this working out? So just talk about that period before you get PAIR.
So I approach this problem very methodically, which I think is a really good way to look at it. And that is really defining what is your zero or your lowest outcome. And so in my case, that 0 point was, okay, I've got the student debt from the MBA. I can't afford to keep my house anymore, but my parents have a spare room and they're more than happy to.
So just to be clear to everybody, so you paid for your MBA yourself and took out a loan for part of your MBA, true?
Correct.
Okay. So you had, so a lot of MBA students have this pressure of, I've got some debt I gotta be worried about, and that was also true for you as well. So it was just want to make that clear. Okay.
Yeah, I think it was roughly $186,000.
Okay, got it. So continue with the analysis here.
So at this point, I had a sports car that I sold, and that gave me enough of a runway. And so I knew exactly how many days I had before I had to make a life-altering choice. And I knew that the lowest outcome of that choice was I go live with mom or dad, and that both of those people would feed me, and that both of those people would provide healthcare for me. And that given that that was the absolute worst outcome, that I felt almost partially obligated to really take a full-on running leap at this. And so I think there was definitely a mental shift with, okay, I am going to go until I completely run out of everything. This is all in. I remember one of the other really, I would call it life-changing moments, was I was supposed to go on a ski trip with a bunch of the business school students. And there was some miserable weather, and I get a phone call from Howie right after my flight had been canceled. And he goes, "Hey, there's a boardroom meeting at the business school right now. I think you should come and tell us about what you're working on." And that was when I met Jillian Manis, who runs Structure VC.
Structure out in the Bay Area, $1 billion fund, and she also is on The Pitch, which is a great podcast where you just get to see what a great person she is. But she's a wonderful supporter who's on our board. Okay, so you meet Jillian.
And she just jumps up and goes, "This company has to exist. You need to meet my partners, Mike and Jacob. You need to meet my connections at Airbnb. This is going to happen." And I do think that was a big mental shift for me. That, okay, we're going to fully run at this until we run out of money.
That was probably March. Of your second year. So, wow, that's great. I don't know that I've heard that story recently, so that's good that you reminded us of it. So Pear puts in, I think that you can say how much they put in. So Pear puts in this amount of money. When exactly does that happen? Because before then, right? January, February, March. I mean, you're trying to right? The
check cleared July 27th of 2018.
And when did you have a sense from them that it was about to happen? Like, do you remember?
July 26th, 2018.
Wow. Okay. So, and we don't have to name names here, but you had talked to a bunch of investors, and a bunch of investors had given you advice, and you had been working for a long time, months, on getting the company ready for them. And there were days where it felt like, hey, the check it's not in my pocket yet, but it feels like it should be coming soon. But I don't know. I kind of felt that way last week, and it didn't happen. I felt like that way last month, and I felt that way 6 months ago. So you were on that emotional roller coaster. Just talk about how important it was. Obviously, it was important, but just tell us more about the story about Pear, the check coming through, and it actually happening. Talk us through what that was like.
So the entire process is a lot like dating. There's certain things you do and don't. You don't ask for a phone number after a first blind date. And so it's relationship building. And part of that relationship building is for that investor to understand your working style and your level of commitment. I remember a very common occurrence was getting phone calls at 3:00 in the morning Eastern time to see if I would respond to 12 p.m. Pacific time, or challenging on models and seeing what your response was to something you, of course, didn't know, but how quickly you could pick up, or how quickly a feature could get introduced into your product and what that turnaround time was. So all of this is, they're not investing at the idea at this phase. They're investing in the actual team and the ability to execute, because there's no expectation for this company to maintain its current state. It just would be completely unrealistic. And so we had been building up this relationship with Pear and their timeline for when they actually wanted to make this investment. Having said that, they were also very good at communicating what the status was. And where they were in that investment process.
And the amount of capital that they invested, if you can say it?
It was $300,000.
300,000. I think that's publicly kind of available because it's, on Crunchbase and it's known. And so you go to San Francisco for, I think, 3 months, and you're working in, I don't know if they call it an accelerator, but you're kind of intensively working with them and working with some of the other people there. A lot of people that are going to business school and thinking about entrepreneurship, they're actually like, well, what's the difference between, why shouldn't I go to an accelerator? So, just describe a little bit of, you don't have to answer that question, but just describe a little bit about what was it like to be in the accelerator? What was that experience like? And kind of, what do you think you learned the most from that experience?
So I think the biggest, or at least my biggest misconception with accelerators was that somebody would hand you all of the solutions. And that's just not the case. What these individuals can hand you is years of expertise and knowledge and learnings from their experiences as well as their network. And so Pear was very good at connecting us with the right people when we needed the right types of advice, as well as gut checking us on some of the assumptions we were making and how we were going about developing the product, as well as making sure to keep us on track with weekly deliverables. So big shout out to Ajay at Pear there. That's
great. Shout out to him from me as well. So, this series is about from business school to startup. There's obviously more to your story because Living Lab has continued on. After Pear, you end up back in Durham. You end up, working out of WeWork. There's a lot that we can tell people about. They should try downloading your app and checking it out if it's in kind of the markets that you want them to be testing it out. But let's just focus in on the business school part, right? So here we are now in the timeline. It's after business school. It's after Pear, and you're looking back. And, was it the right choice for you? And just talk a little bit at like a 50,000 foot level. I mean, you've kind of gone through 2.5 years of a transformative experience where previously you were working, at a company doing, I think, data analytics and some other things. And then here you are, CEO of your own company, which has received some funding. Just talk a little bit more about that overall experience.
My goodness, this is a big question. The process of going to business school, I think, was, as you pointed out, very transformative and very necessary to get me to those next steps, both on an emotional and almost, it's a mental level, to really be able to sit back and understand the relationships and how to leverage your network to drive those ideas forward. I don't think that's something I at all had coming out of my quantitative background doing data analytics. I think while I may have been on a team that was very good at executing on a lot of technical products, that doesn't necessarily make us great idea people to actually pitch, lead, and raise venture funding for a company. And so there were some major building blocks there that I was missing. I think just to point to one that I remember I thought was of very little value was all of the speech courses and presentation courses that we had at business school. Coming out of that program, it was so glaringly apparent how much better our class as a whole was at presenting ideas in a very meaningful way.
So I think your point there, just to make sure I understood it correctly, is that going into the management communications courses, the speech courses, maybe you were like, I don't know how valuable this is going to be. And then at the end of it, you're like, wow, that was really valuable.
I think that's a very fair way of putting that.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And So I just want to give some airtime here for you to give a pitch for Duke students or Fuqua students that are coming to campus and are looking for a roommate, are looking for a place to live. What should they do? And also, I don't know what your next market is, but maybe we can give a shout out to anybody else that should be downloading it. But let's just talk a little bit. We've already kind of talked a little bit about Living Lab, but let's just start at the beginning. If you are a Duke student that blank, then you should download Living Lab because of blank, kind of thing.
Oh yeah, certainly. If you are a Duke student or anyone who wants to live in the Raleigh-Durham Triangle, you should absolutely check it out. The whole notion is that it is very difficult and it's an arduous process to try and find other people to live with and find properties that are compatible with those people. And so we leverage technology to make it a very easy space to search. So you give us preferences for budget, location, and timing, and we can show you the iterations, compatibilities between people and property and leases that fit your needs. So please do check it out. We launched our latest iteration yesterday. The website is mylivinglab.com. And if you have an idea for how to make it better, just email me directly on LinkedIn.
That's great. Thank you so much, Mitchell. Let's see the shirt one more time here. Show the pride there. It was great to chat with you, and thanks so much for spending the time and sharing your insights.
Great. Thanks, Howie. You're awesome. I really appreciate it.